So Orleans House is very pleased to be staging this major exhibition of madge, gill, and today's event is a very special aspect of this project. Thanks to the Wellcome Trust, we've been able to commission new research into Gill's life and work, bringing together art historians and collectors, psychiatrists and medical historians, to help us think about Gill, outsider art, and the links between mental health and creativity. Orleans House has been active in exploring these links since 1998, holding exhibitions of Richard Dad and Cynthia Pell, as well as group outsider art exhibitions, and our long-term support of Art and Soul, which is a group of present-day artists who celebrate art and mental and emotional well-being. So without further ado, I'll now hand over to David O'Flynn. We're honoured that David has agreed to chair today. David is a consultant psychiatrist with South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust and the chair of the Adamson Collection, which is a collection of British art therapies, or paintings to do with British art therapy. Okay, so over to you then, David.
Thank you. Well, thanks everyone for coming today. Can you hear me okay at the back, hopefully? And thanks for dragging yourselves away from the rugby to be here instead.
No problem.
Probably why you're here. Obviously the talk was mainly about madge, gill today and reflecting on her work. But a lot of the conversation is when you go beyond the seeing of the work, we're looking at the work, and try to how you put this kind of art in the kind of context. And it's complicated, and I'm just going to say a few words, just a few bones for you to hang some of the subsequent talks on. I think you can see this work in terms of history, the cultural history of the century, and her involvement with the various key figures in 20th century art history and cultural history. Any kind of this art brings up questions about a person, their life experiences, their psychopathology, their mental disorder. There's a whole debate, vocabulary around psychology, aesthetics, creativity. Again, that will be a theme that comes up today. And I think the third big theme is going to be, the third big hook is this thing called outsider art. And some of you may be very aware of outsider art, some of you are very new idea. It's a complicated and it's a wide umbrella, a broad church, but themes are like people, artists who are self-taught, people who are creating for their own purposes rather than an audience, maybe some sort of self-therapy, maybe it's a compulsion to create, working outside cultural norms, that sort of art. And people find their own visual vocabulary, and madge, gill clearly fits into that box. But I think during the afternoon, those three areas will become clearer. And because of those three areas, we've got an art historian, a historian, and a psychologist doing talks today. It fits in with that narrative. So, without further ado, we'll start with Roger Cardinal, who I've got his brief here. So, we can blame or thank Roger for the phrase outsider art, which he first used in 1972 in his book Outsider Art. He was the first man to translate this French concept of art brut into outsider art. So in 1979, he created with Victor Musgrove the pioneering exhibition Outsiders at the Hayward Gallery. So in 1979, nobody was really thinking about this art. Think how far it's come. I mean, we've got Imagine, the TV program Imagine on Tuesday, Outsider Art. The Biennale, Venice Biennale, major show in Paris, 2 shows in London. It's much more mainstream than it might have been in 1979 when Roger first had the show. He's written extensively on self-taught art, including primitive painters, marginalia, perspective on outsider art. He's written essays on outsider art, outsider aesthetics, outsider architecture, autistic art, prison art, and memory paintings. He's currently preparing a monograph on madge, gill. So without further ado, take the stand, Roger.
Thank you. Well, we set up a possible program of references here to psychiatry, psychoanalysis, literary criticism, you name it. Everybody's waiting to hear what other people have got to say. And there are a lot of voices that have clubbed together to make madge, gill this subject of discussion. So we've all got to do more background reading before we can really begin to get to grips with this issue of what's going on here. We can, however, I think already begin to appreciate madge, gill through a very obvious direction, which most art historians would poo-poo as being the first stage. But this is, I think, where we're at. There's a new set of reasons, so to speak, for looking at biography as a way into the work of an interesting and rather complicated artist such as Madge Gill. She doesn't have the usual trappings of an artist. She doesn't have a studio. She has an old table in her front room, and they moved the piano back to give a bit more space, and they put up a little working object mechanism so that she can look at her pictures section by section as she moves along. Some of these long calico rolls, as you'll be appreciated from the Crucifixion of the Soul in the exhibition, are metre upon metre long. So there was a difficulty in her own approach to the technique, as it were, of making a kind of mural statement. Going in, as it were, from one angle is to sort of find out where she was living, where she was born, why she was born in that particular place, and what was going on around the birth, where she worked, what happened to her in her teenage years, why did she marry her cousin, what was going on with the rest of the family, who's who, what are the sons that Madge had. She had three sons altogether. What construction can we place upon the fact that she also had a daughter who was stillborn? What construction can we place upon the magical references to Mir Ninarest, her spirit guide? What was going on in the area of spiritualism? What should we know, as it were, through history and cultural investigation of the circumstances that she felt to be prominent and primary in her perception of her role? She was called, in some sense, to do these pictures. It was her vocation, but it was more than a vocation that most artists will obviously talk about. When I first went to the Tate Gallery, I sat down and cried, looking at Richard Dadd or something. And artists are found, or find themselves being found, so to speak, through a revelatory experience. In Madge Gill's case, it was an experience that trembles with associations in all the different areas that we've begun to investigate, namely psychiatry and the history of spiritualism and working class culture generally in the East End in the 1920s and 30s. We need to know more about all these things before witnesses die off, and we would ideally be rushing around, all people here present, gathering in fresh material. It's a life story that one reconstructs, not unlike her dress that you'll see a photograph of in the exhibition, made up of different fragments. It's throwing together the bits and pieces and then trying to make a reasonable guess as to how they fit that is so difficult. I'm busy writing a long biography of Madge Gill, and every day I realise something else about her that I hadn't thought of connecting, that makes it clear that she had already thought about such and such an approach 20 years before, thanks to a letter we have, or again that she's heard of Conan Doyle and his interest in spiritualism and doesn't think much of his theory, and that she herself was, in a curious way, both illiterate, because her spelling is abominable when she writes, but strangely cultured in that she's heard of things, she's picked up things. It's a kind of illiteracy is not quite the word I want, but she's not a polished writer, not a polished stylist, and yet she's able to discuss quite profound ideas in some of her writing. Madge Gill was illegitimate. She was brought up by foster parents because the family that her mother came from were more or less set against having much to do with this bastard child. So her life, the beginning of her life is really messed up, in the extreme sense. She was sent to Dr. Barnardo's orphanage, which then a few years later thought it a good idea to put her on the list of children who deserved a better start in life and therefore should be allowed to go to the New World, to Canada or North America, to become a domestic servant, potentially on a farm in Ontario, as happened to Madge. So her early life was one of being a little bit shoved around, not being valued very highly. She could help around the house. She helped babysit the children on one particular farm, and then took them to school. And it's said that she may have had a few rudiments of school training, proper education, as it were, at that time. When she got back, as she did eventually from Canada in her 18th year, she set about looking around as to what she could do in the world with this very unfortunate start. Any mention of illegitimacy was bound to be a hampering factor in any application. She had a brief job as a nurse in Whipps Cross Hospital. I guess they weren't too worried about her illegitimacy, but other jobs might have been close to her. She could not, as it were, become a domestic servant very readily, with people wondering quite where she'd come from and who her relatives were and so on. So she kind of flits through the early years of her mature life without much orientation towards any particular career or doing something positive with her life. But after she was married, she speedily found that an interest in spiritualism that her aunt had really started her off on could now be developed. And suddenly, whether it be deliberate, as it were, induced revelation, or whether revelation is something that just happens to you at a certain point when you're interested in something, she suddenly was possessed by an idea about becoming a medium. She wasn't really choosing it in her own idea, but she was now being chosen, she was being possessed by a spirit guide. And this guide would then direct her towards the tasks that lay ahead. The rest of her life, another 40 years to go, because this happened more or less at the age of 40, she suddenly moved into top gear after footling around, after being pushed about, having had various disappointments. Her youngest son died in the flu epidemic. Also, there are all sorts of reasons why she was a really diminished person. And suddenly she found her theme, as it were. She's now going to be a medium. She's going to do some sort of confirming gestures, like holding a seance, or a bit of clairvoyant, oracular speech, telling people things that are going to happen to them. She didn't get on very well with that. Nothing really pleased her very much. She wasn't all that keen, really, to deal with other people, but she did have the most obvious resource, which was to retire to her own intimate sphere at home and produce the secretive life's work of wonderful pictures. We're privileged to see some of them because they've luckily survived thanks to her son Laurie, who donated them to the local council. And it's largely from the Newham collection that we've been privileged to make our selection for the current exhibition. It's only a small part of what she did. She made dozens and dozens of large calico pictures, any one of which would fill one of these walls of this room. She made dozens and dozens, indeed hundreds of pictures on a larger scale, and then she produced thousands of postcards which she annotated and inscribed with strange sayings and wonderful pictures. Who are these people in the pictures, you may now want to ask? What's it all about? What happens when somebody says that they're a medium in touch with a world beyond this one? What kind of pictures would they be making? Do they have a purpose? Are they propaganda? Are they ways of confirming that she's in touch with the next life? What was she up to, really? Or again, was she really deep down explicable in terms of spontaneous art making? The more that we research into outsider art, the more we're aware that very ordinary people, or unlikely people, shall we say, who have no connection with the art world, are able to produce the most amazing visual and pictorial works. So which option do we want, as it were, as a starting point? Well, we have our next speaker to orient us to one area of concern. And I'll let him take over now.
Thank you.
We've got 3 speakers, and we've got an hour. The second hour is going to be about a group discussion. But are there any points of fact you would like to check with Roger? Any specific questions for Roger's talk? Or should we go straight to our next speaker? Because there's plenty of time later for discussion.
Can I just ask what sort of age she started working, painting, drawing? Do you know? Have you any idea?
How many? Sorry.
What sort of age was she?
Well, she began at about 40, late 30s.
Late 30s.
She may have done work earlier on.
Yes.
She then discarded and just got lost. But the real revelation was more or less midway through her life.
Thank you.
And there is a piece that she writes later on about Dante. You might remember, if you know your Dante. It starts out, as it were, with being the middle of his life.
Any other questions about that sort of biographical overview, which gives some facts about Madge's life? So we'll welcome Rob Ellis, who's a senior lecturer in history at the University of Huddersfield and principal investigator for Heritage and Stigma, the history of mental health care, an Arts and Humanities Research Council project. His main research interest is the history of mental health care. He's also published on various community engagement projects, including a project with Thackeray Medical Museum and South West Yorkshire Partnership NHS Foundation Trust called Sound, Craft, Vision and Place, which was funded by the National Heritage Fund, National Loyalties Fund. Well, these organisations have the longest names, don't they? Sorry. All our stories. That led on to funding for another project called Nothing Without Us, the history of learning disabilities in Leeds, and Our Minds, Our History. So to bring a historical, institutional perspective, take a stand.
Thank you. I am going to stand. I prefer to stand. And I'm leaning against the post because sometimes when I'm doing lectures, I end up pacing. So there's a chance that I will start pacing. And you'll tell from the introduction and from my voice, I'm a northerner. I'm sorry for that. I am sorry.
Lucky you.
I'm glad already some of the themes that I'm going to talk about have already been mentioned, and part of that, one of those things is the domestic sphere that Roger mentioned, but also what this disparate group that outsider art is. And I have to make another confession before we even start. I know nothing about outsider art. I know nothing about art. I am a historian of mental ill health, and you need to bear that in mind. You need to come with me on that journey because I'm feeling my way through outsider art as much as you are. But there are some things I think I can bring to this conversation about representations of madge in terms of mental ill health and where that comes from. So on the slide, as a starting point, I was thinking, what can I put on the slide? And I have to admit, I was struggling to find an image for the slide. And I've chosen one from the Adamson collection. And there are people on this panel who know more about the Adamson collection, that know a lot more about outsider art than me. But one of the things I think that's interesting about this, the first thing, is that the artist is unknown. And that's one of the things that I'm going to consider as we go through this 10 minutes or so. The other reason that I put it on is because it's got some colour. And most of my slides as a historian are black and white. So I thought I'd start with some colour nice and early on. But it reminds us of those links very clearly because it's from an unknown artist who was in a mental institution. It reminds us of those links between mental illness, institutions and art therapy. And I think that's a nice way to think about it. So there are a couple of things I want to do in this short 10 minutes. And the first is to explain why madge is so clearly linked to mental ill health. But then I want to talk, because of my research interest and the things that I like to write about normally, is why madge in other circumstances might have been institutionalised, how she might not have been able to retreat to a domestic sphere, as Roger mentioned then. Then I think I want to talk about why she wasn't and how she was able to create art within that domestic sphere. Which means, I think, the key point of all this is that we get to know madge as an artist first and foremost, and not as a patient or as someone suffering from mental ill health. So that's the intro, and here's the starting point. When I did the research as a historian, I tried to find some contemporary references to madge's art in the 30s. And when I looked at the reviews, there was no mention at all of anything to do with madge's mental state. Nothing at all. And that's kind of not surprising because whenever you're researching historical people in the past, If they are not at the very top, it's very difficult to find biographical details. It takes a lot of research, it takes a lot of time. It's very difficult to piece these things together. So when I looked at the original reviews, they were all about the art. They were all about the things that Madge had done. So there was no mention of a spirit guide in the 30s, nothing like that at all. I found some examples from the Times in the 1930s, and I think that's important because it's a national, well-respected newspaper that sends its art critic to go and look at the work, look at the exhibition that Madge's art is part of. And they describe her paint drawings as inspiration. And the only sense that we get that something's different is one of the reviewers describes her as a curious talent. That's the only hint. Now, in the 1960s, things change, from the 1960s. And one of the reasons things change is because she dies in the 60s. And people become interested in outsider art, and journalists go and start piecing together some of that fragmentary evidence about who Madge was. And I've included some more recent reviews of Madge's work, and you can see a theme that's developing. It's not about outsider art, or if it is about outsider art, it's linking outsider art with mental ill health. So we've got two very well-known newspapers on the slide, one The Observer, one The Mail, one a broadsheet, one a tabloid, and you can see the headline figure, creating away like mad. Brilliant or just plain bonkers. And what's happening is you're getting a general link between the art that Madge produces and outsider art generally. Now those reviews, 79 and 2000, 21st century, just plain bonkers. These are about outsider art generally, and Madge is part of a much wider range of outsider artists in that period. But the Times, in 1968, is all about Madge. And they're interested in finding out more about Madge in 1968. And what they do is they send a journalist to the area where she lived, and they interview locals that knew her in the past, in the 1960s. And in the article, when you read the article, it says the neighbours remember her vividly. The neighbours remember her vividly. And I've just got two examples of people that they asked when they were talking about Madge. And one of them, who worked for Madge Gill's son in an umbrella shop, remembers the artist as rather an eccentric person. She would often turn her back on you and take her glass eye out to clean it. And then there's another one, which I think is more important, and he talks about the goings-on. The goings-on, I think what he's talking about possibly is the seances and the spiritualism, the goings-on. That's the way it's described in the article. And he concluded it was not the spirits that influenced her, but the gin. So that turns that headline into a pun. The spirits are all about drink. The spirits are all about drink. So what's happening is we're getting that link. I told you I'd start pacing. We get that link between outsider art and mental illness. Now, this is an example of a famous outsider artist. You all know who he is. It's Richard Dadd. And I think I'm not going to talk about Richard Dadd because, again, lots of people here know more about Richard Dadd, much more about Richard Dadd than I do. But I think he's interesting for a couple of reasons. Richard Dadd was an artist before he went into an institution. Then he stabs his dad, then he's in an asylum in France, then he goes to Bedlam, and then he goes to Broadmoor. And when he's in those institutions, when he's in Bethlehem, when he's in the Bethlehem Royal Hospitals, he doesn't really get any treatment, but he's allowed to paint. He's allowed to paint, and that's become the story. In some ways, he's become the outsider artist. And one of the things about Dadd is people become interested in him in the 60s. Nobody really, it's much the same way with Madge Gill. Nobody knows the backstory until people start digging around in the 60s. And what happens when we're talking about madness and outsider art is this clear link. So when you read the reviews, outsider art, it was claimed, I'm quoting now, it reflects the sometimes unstable corners of the minds of these creative individuals. It reflects a catalogue of frustrations and losses. And in this sense, there's an attempt to link a disparate group. David mentioned a disparate group of outsider artists, and what's happening is they're all becoming linked under this one thing, which is a fragile mental state, which is how Madge's mental state is described as fragile. So to sum up then, there are a couple of things happening in these reviews. Outsider artists are becoming defined by the mental state. More specifically, Madge's art is becoming to be defined by her eccentricities on the one hand, or possibly a fragile mental state. And of course, the more we know about Madge's biography, the easier it is to link all these things together. We can look at the things that might have had a massive impact on her life. Think of the things that happened to her. And I want to talk a little bit about how she might have been institutionalised in the first place. So when we think about Madge's biography, she loses children, she loses an eye, there's a war going on, the Spanish flu. But I want to give you an example of how her spiritualism might have led to her being institutionalised in other circumstances. So one of the things I work on when I'm not visiting Twickenham is an institution in the north of England which is called the West Riding Pauper Lunatic Asylum. It serves the whole of Yorkshire, in fact, and it opens in 1818. And if you're interested in looking at old case notes, there's a website called History to Her Story. All the old case notes for 100 years for all the female patients are there, free to look at, and it's great. If you can get past the copper plate writing, they're very, very interesting. And the example I've got on here, and I've put one in the book as well, which is very similar. I think it speaks to us about the kind of thing that Madge went through. So you can look on, I've highlighted the bits in yellow, another attempt to get some colour into the slides. And what you can see about Mary is, it's 1875, so it's a few years before. But you can see she was a worker in the fields. That was her latest occupation. And she's transferred from the workhouse. She's transferred from the workhouse to the asylum. But the key things on there is she's a widow. She has no family, which is the reason that she's in the workhouse in the first place. But you can see just on the little box there, she's haunted or bewitched. And I think there's a similarity there between what happens to Madge and what happens to Mary. So, when I go through the case notes of that, I can see just at the bottom right-hand corner, she is neither epileptic, she's not suicidal, and she's not dangerous to others. That's really important, because if you're dangerous to yourself or to others, that's a good enough reason to send you away, because people might be a little bit worried about you. The doctor writes, as far as the history of her attack is known, there has never been any marked change in the character of her symptoms the whole time she has been under observation, except that the symptoms were less violent than at present. Less violent at present. She only gets violent when she's transferred into the asylum. The doctor continues, she expressed the belief that she is haunted by some living person who is to bewitch her for about 7 years, and at the end of this time their power over her will cease. When put out of sorts, she gives way to violent and threatening language. She has never assaulted anyone. And all through the case notes, what you can see is that Mary is believed to suffer from delusions, haunted or bewitched. And the way it works in the 19th century, no care. She's not going to be allowed to paint, although some people in asylums do paint. They put her to work in the laundry. And it's kind of a happy story because in 3 years she's discharged as recovered. So not quite the same as Madge, but we can see that unseen force, those two things. Madge talks about an unseen force, there's an unseen force here. So explaining why Madge was institutionalised and why Mary wasn't are two sides of the same coin. And when we look at this image, if you've seen that image over there in the gallery, you can see how big it is. And I think that's a really interesting point. So we can see immediately that Madge, in this period, lives in a well-furnished home. And in the history of mental illness, the more money you have, the more chances you've got to avoid big institutions. So we know that Madge went to a clinic in Hove. But the main thing, as Roger's already alluded to, is the support that she receives from her family. So when Laurie describes Madge being overtaken by a spiritual guide, he describes it as overwhelming and frightening. But this we can contextualise in terms of a long-term interest in spiritualism. It's not new and different for the family. They're aware of Madge's belief in spirits. And the key point is what Roger describes as the relationship with a son which is bound by mutual affection. And look at that long image there. We can see her working on it. And when we compare Madge with Mary, Madge has a supportive family, Mary, who is a widow, doesn't. This meant Madge could be supported at home, whereas Mary could not. For Madge, the spirit guide was contextualised by the family interest in spiritualism. For Mary, it was something odd. For Madge, her economic circumstances meant that she could work on her art, whereas Mary, it meant first the workhouse and then the asylum. And I think there's an irony here, which is because she's not institutionalised for a long period of time, this is the key point, we know her as an artist. We don't know her as a patient that creates art. We know her as an artist that had some problems, possibly with mental illness. So, I always finish with a conclusion, and just some quick reminders. Apart from the reference to a curious talent, early reviews did not consider Madge's mental state. that link only comes later as some of the unorthodox details, what seem to us as unorthodox details of her life, become transparent after her death. Nevertheless, there are particular crises in her life that might have led to her being institutionalised. The reason she wasn't appears to be intimately tied up with the support she received from her family. Without that, it seems unlikely that she would ever prosper as an artist, outsider or otherwise.
Well, that's excellent, Rob. Thank you so much. Again, are there any specific questions about Rob's presentation, which I thought was fascinating, and that what we want to bring out at this point, or we're going to save it till the longer discussion in the end? Anything that anybody wants to stop? Paul, did you want to get yourself settled in? Anything that... One thing I do find interesting about outsider art is that the history, the biography of the creator becomes important, and many arguably more important than the mainstream artists. We pick around the life, and some people pick around the lives to try and make a mental health diagnosis. I personally find that worrying. I think it's partly because the outsider artist isn't producing art for an audience. We come later and say what you're doing is art, and also the definition is always about the person, the creator. The outsider is the person. I think because that's a thing that's already beginning to emerge. I just planting things for discussions while all get set up. Any other questions arising? Any questions arising out of Rob's presentation, or shall I introduce you to Paul? Paul Campbell is...
Sorry, can I just say something? I'm really puzzled about it, because when we talk about mental health here and the connection with what she's producing, you know, and that it's just related to her head. It's almost as if her head's separated from her body. When somebody is experiencing something like that, it's not just a mental health problem. It could be something physical. Many people are institutionalised for women who have postnatal depression. It's usually a lack of progesterone. Women who have problems later on could be thyroid. I myself have had that experience. I know many other very, very creative people, men and women, who have been in the same situation. And I think it's just very sad that we tend to separate that whole, you know, it's a mental health issue. It's not a mental health, it's a mind-body dynamic. And in all respect to your very good
I
talk.
don't think we've got as far as saying that has a mental health one, but I take your point. There's an important question, yeah.
As a historian, I mean, I am a historian of mental ill health, and there is nothing in Madge's biography that says that she's mentally ill. So for me, it's very difficult. I think what I tried to present in that presentation was those definitions come from outside Madge's circle, and that's what we have to deal with. We can't go back in time and we can't work out whether she was mentally ill or not. But all those definitions have come after she died, or that's the way it seems. Roger will tell you that she did spend some time in a clinic, and maybe we can get the case notes. But again, when you look at the history of mental ill health, there's been a lot written about the power of doctors, but actually the definition comes from the family. The first people that will make any move towards institutionalising someone or going towards care always comes from, if there is a family, always comes from within the family. So when those case notes on the slide that I showed you, what happens is the doctor is confirming what the family says. He takes everything into account from the family, and he will either say, yes, I agree, or no, I don't agree. And very rarely he says, no, I don't agree. And sometimes they will say, this person does not seem to be a fit person for this institution, but it'll take 3 months to prove it. So that's the relationship that we have to bear in mind. So I aren't saying that she was mentally ill, but other people did.
I'm just very respectful of both the talks, but I'm just very aware of the bigger picture.
Yeah, please, this is the discussions we want, because there's so many questions in this area, so few answers, so please don't feel you should apologise. And you could be as anti-psychiatry as you like, I'm fine. But I think Roger had, please don't apologise. I think Roger wants to come in as well.
Well, I've been researching her life in some detail recently, and thanks to Sarah Ayad, who wrote the excellent piece in the catalogue on Madge's health problems, which are multiple and indeed include sorts of physical symptoms. Her husband came home very late after the war and couldn't get a job. So around about 1920-21, they were actually on the breadline. That's when they went to see potentially a psychiatrist who might have thought she should be sectioned because of doing harm to others or whatever. I mean, the definitions and so on are all a matter of opinion very often. And also, you can get bullied into producing a right sort of result if you've been set up in some way. I mean, I'm very distrustful of definitive decisions which cannot be reversed. And if you do find somebody borderline crazy, the worst place for them is an asylum with all the other crazy people. It can be argued. It depends really on the actual therapy that goes on, which is sometimes rather minimal. I do remember in the 1960s when we used to teach a course about madness and art, and we went up to the local lunatic asylum in Charlton and were taken successively from ward to ward, being assured that there were no locks on any of these doors. Excuse me. They were indeed being locked behind us. And my colleague rather mischievously said, may I ask a question to the person guiding us? He said, is your window therapy actually working? He said. And all the patients were gawping out of the window.
Yes.
You know what they were thinking of?
Yes.
This is the place we cannot go to. This is so it's almost symbolic, that glass that separates them from ordinary life, and which is, you know, the locus of desire in effect. I'm rambling on now, I'm sorry.
No.
But there was a very acute moment in Madge's biography when she could have been, at a certain point, diagnosed and might have been whisked away against her own desire and potentially locked up.
Yes, but when I spoke to Kay Renfield when she wrote her book, The Unquiet Mind, you know, Kay says that when you have these periods of psychosis or these out-of-body experiences, it can actually, it produced in her some of her best writing, and sometimes actually to take the person away from that ability to do that creativity actually makes them much worse, and that there are lots of elements that contribute to being in that situation. And if you have other family members that think, oh Jesus, this is out of context, this person's not quite normal, and they put them into institution, it's not because they're academic enough to make that decision. The family usually make that decision because they're not academic enough to make that decision. They don't know what's happening and they're afraid as well. So I'm very respectful of what everybody's saying, but I just wanted to throw that into the pot because I think it's very important.
It's most welcome. It's most welcome. It does bring up for me the issue about what we call the pathography. I blame whoever wrote The Madness of George III. It's this going back and looking at the art, looking at the life, and trying to find evidence for mental disorder and post-mortem diagnosis. I personally find they take away from the work in a way. Does it matter whether she had a mental label we can put on her now? What matters is the work, and taking it, any attempt to look at the biography just takes you away from that. But we end up being interested in it, but I don't think it should be a dominating thing. And I was saying to Roger, secretly, I would like a bit of symptoms here and there, secretly. But when I'm looking outside art, it takes away from the art to make it diagnostic. They did that in the 1930s quite a lot. Art represented mental symptoms, and I find it really depressing things like schizophrenics like to use the colour red, was one of the Cunningham said, and Freud was right when those in the 1930s, more psychiatrists said you could diagnose schizophrenia from a series of paintings. I mean, I think that's total rubbish. Because what we've seen outside art is maybe major events like psychosis unleashing some creativity that's independent. And that's what we want to talk about, I think, later today. But that might be a good point to move to Paul, if that's okay. Is that shutting you up? So, I didn't do it, did you? Did I read it? No. Sorry. So Paul brings us, which is perfect timing because Paul brings a psychological perspective. He's a clinical health psychologist and professor of psychology and public health at Canterbury Christ Church University. And, if that's not enough, research director of the Solomon Centre for Applied Psychology. He's the founding co-editor of Arts and Health and international journal for research, policy and practice. His research interests include the use of material objects in human development, with particular interest in how galleries and museums can be locations for community-based public health interventions and programmes. He's a fellow of the Royal College, the Royal Society for Public Health and the Royal Society for the Arts. So, Paul, take the stand.
Thank you very much. I'd like to also apologize for my deep East Sussex accent. I hope you can. I'd like to start by thanking very much the Orleans House Gallery for not only inviting me to participate in this, but for organizing the exhibition in the way they did. It's highly unusual to invite people from different disciplines, and it's not just the three of us that are presented today, but the catalog, which is really a superb catalog of many, many different perspectives about the work of Madge Gill. So if you haven't bought it, at £7.50, it's a real steal, so I highly recommend it. It's really a tour de force. Okay, I may stand or sit because I have an injured right leg, so we'll see how it goes. Okay. My presentation this afternoon seeks to provide one way, and I want to emphasize only one way, to understand our individual relationships with the work of Madge Gill. I do so without analyzing her or her work, without categorizing her, or suggesting there is only one way to approach her art. And I will draw very briefly on the theories, some Freudian theories, some Jungian theories, and theories of resilience and well-being. Those two are more contemporary theories of the last several decades. My invitation to you is this. When you look at her work, try and suspend what you know about our history, our criticism, perspective, symbolism, formalism, and the debate between intrinsic and instrumental value of art. Try and approach the work in the moment of viewing it. We will have a go at this in a few minutes, but when you are next in the gallery, try it out on your own. In studying the lives of artists, it is sometimes tempting to look for a unifying theme to try to understand their creative development, as we're starting to do today already. For those artists who have had unusual or traumatic life experiences, or for those who engage in bizarre or incomprehensible behavior, and Vincent van Gogh comes to mind as a very sort of extreme example of chopping off his ear, the underlying themes that are often identified are linked to some sort of psychological disturbance or so-called mental illness. And Madge Gill did have a life filled with tremendous challenges. In her early years, rejection by family members, which I think is stronger than is often acknowledged, emotional and physical abandonment, a country that turned its back on her and hundreds of other orphans, sending them off to Canada. And as an adult, she experienced the death of an 8-year-old son from pneumonia, had septic poisoning of her gums, had 3 miscarriages, gave birth to a stillborn girl, lost sight in one eye due to cancer, and had a marriage that increasingly was filled with arguments and disagreement. Yet Madge Gill not only survived all this, but to some extent she thrived, but not without emotional upheaval and trauma. She did go on to embrace spiritualism, as we've heard. She's become a medium, and a prolific, if not a sometimes reclusive, artist. She not only made art, but she also created an identity for herself as she bridged the worlds of spiritualism and mediums on the one hand, and being a self-taught artist on the other. And I think in many ways, we can begin to identify, we all try to seek an identity, and we have maybe perhaps multiple identities, and I think Madge Gill did as well, through both spiritualism and her art. One way to understand her life and work might be to formulate an equation that looks something like artistic creativity equals abnormal behavior and or challenging life events plus regression and sublimation. While this equation is somewhat of an oversimplification, there are those in the psychology and mental health fields that focus on an illness, a mental disturbance, or something abnormal to explain creative artistic behavior. There are volumes and volumes written from that perspective. Madge Gill provides a good deal of material for us to have a go at adding her life to this equation, which would be more of a traditional Freudian approach, looking at art and creativity as a kind of side effect to manage instinctual drive emanating from the id, a term you probably all have heard of at some point, such as aggression, unconscious sexual urges, and the death instinct, and the like. According to Freud and many of his followers, we are human insofar as we transcend our animal state, yet also miserable because of it, to a greater or lesser degree. We are at times fitting in and not fitting into the social structure of our times, something that Madge Gill seemed to experience her entire life. Of all the possible sublimations of instinctual desires such as sport, going on rugby just a few meters from here, hobbies, excelling at work, hunting, religion, etc., art is unique in attempting to integrate in metaphorical form the basic dualisms inherent in human condition, according to a more classical Freudian tradition. The main form of this integration is characterized in the Freudian system as the primary process, which is the language of the unconscious, of id impulses, dreams, and less than mature relationships, referred to as Freud by the rather cumbersome phrase infantile object relations. This is in contrast to secondary processes such as that are conscious and rational. Okay, so there's two dual systems that Freud developed. Art is therefore, according to Freud, not merely regressive in the sense of being the expression of early impulses, nor is it exclusively sublimation in the sense of being a useful, rationally conceived artifact serving the goals of civilization at the cost of renouncing our instinctual drives. So instead of killing the mother that put you in an orphanage, one makes art as a way to come to terms with this massive rejecting action by a parent. The problem with this conceptualization of art, with art making, is that it leaves out the very important notion of creativity, which others have argued, and I concur, is a positive life force. And according to Carl Jung, the noted Swiss analyst who parted ways with Freud in 1912, creativity as a force is inherently human and is essential to human development. I'd like to build on Jung's conceptualization of active imagination, which he described as an active and directed interplay between conscious and unconscious processes that can be facilitated by art making. By following a different path, I'm taking the fork in the road here away from Freud, and to consider Madge Gill's creative endeavors in adulthood as a positive, evolutionarily supported behavioral response to trauma and loss. The artistic and creative response, and keep in mind, as a medium that is also a creative response, one could argue, was a means to develop and enhance psychological well-being in her often challenging life. This does not mean that her art making was a pleasant, necessarily, or relaxing activity all the time. Sometimes we know it wasn't. But it did for many years sustain her and provide her with a public and perhaps personal identity. And according to Jungian perspectives, involving active imagination, which is an activity that weaves back and forth between conscious and unconscious processes, between what is known and unknown. And it is possible, and I say this very cautiously because I think we'd have to interview Madge Gill herself, which we can't do, to find out what was happening, what was she experiencing as she was making art. There has been some references to that, but we don't know exactly what was happening for her. So discarding Freudian theory, and I'm not an anti-Freudianist at all, I think many of his theories are quite useful, but his theory about art I think is a bit mislaid. So discarding Freudian theory that creativity in art making is a defense or control mechanism to manage underlying impulses, I would argue that an alternative view is to view art making in Madge Gill's life, and for that matter perhaps any of our lives, for those of us who make art, is to see it as an activity or behavior that is evolutionarily supported. Now, we've been making art in some form or other for thousands and thousands of years, and some would argue hundreds of thousands of years. If any of you had the opportunity to see the exhibition at the British Museum that ended earlier this year, Ice Art, Arrival of the Modern Mind, there's quite a lot of evidence for evolutionary support of art. So that's a contrast to say that it's a response to trying to control impulses or aggressive impulses. I don't think there's substantial evidence of that. So for Madge Gill, it was a way, I would say, not a way to sublimate or control, but was a creative, affirming behavior. Sorry. So perhaps evolutionary theory, together with Jung's concept of active imagination and the psychological theories of resilience and well-being, are ways to further understand Madge Gill's work as it may relate to our own lives. Psychological resilience, I'll just very briefly touch upon this, is an individual's tendency to cope with stress and adversity. This coping may result in the individual's bouncing back to a previous state of functioning, or simply not showing negative effects. A third, more controversial form of resilience is sometimes referred to as post-traumatic growth, where in the experience adversity leads to better functioning, such as getting an inoculation gives one the capacity to cope well to future exposure to disease. There is some evidence that in response to a very traumatic situation, people grow and through sort of a post-traumatic experience. So they don't remain post-traumatized, but there is psychological growth. Resilience is most commonly understood as a process and not as a trait of an individual. I'm going to talk very briefly also about well-being. There is no consensus around a single definition of well-being. Well-being, you might have heard this in the news lately. The Prime Minister and the government has a well-being measure that some of you may have taken. We're the third country to develop national well-being assessment scales, following France and Canada. And it's to look at something other than gross domestic product as measuring the well-being of the country. And that's one use of well-being. But well-being is also becoming more and more used in mental health rather than looking at psychopathology as also in physical health, rather than looking at psychopathology or physical illness as a defining factor in someone's health, also looking at well-being in addition to that. So there's no consensus, however, around a single definition of well-being, but there's a general agreement that at minimum, well-being includes the presence of positive emotions and moods, such as contentment and happiness, superseding negative emotions, such as depression or anxiety, satisfaction with life, fulfillment, and positive functioning. Now, well-being, or sort of good or positive well-being, isn't something that's constant. Probably in none of our lives do we have the same level of well-being all the time. So think of it sort of as the equilibrium. As we're confronted with life stresses, that well-being may tilt towards more of a negative position, and when positive things happen to us, when we engage in things that are interesting to us, that are supportive, that are enjoyable, then maybe feel more of a positive bit of well-being. So I would contend that one way of thinking about Madge Gill is as when in her life there was resilience, and I think she's a very resilient person considering the many challenges she experienced, but not resilient every single moment in her life. There were times where that resilience clearly was lowered, and also with well-being, that her art making and being the medium may have in fact for her been something that very much added to her sense of well-being. In concluding this part of my talk, I'd like to put forth that to understand Madge Gill, one needs to consider her life circumstances and how creativity and art making sustained her by providing a way to help create some sort of equilibrium, as I've just said, which was not only a response to trauma, but was also a creative action that enhanced her well-being, as such activities can enhance our own. Now, the final portion of my presentation will involve a group Rorschach experience that will hopefully serve to bring the understanding of her work a little closer to home for you here today. Now, many of you may be familiar with the Rorschach ink block technique. It was developed by Hermann Rorschach in the early part of the 20th century. He tragically died at the age of 38, but if he had lived, I think we might have seen some interesting further developments from his perspective about the Rorschach technique. And it's still used in some mental health clinics and hospitals around the world. Although he never meant his technique to be used in a group community setting, such as this seminar, I think the work of Madge Gill lends itself to borrow from Dr. Rorschach, and also heeding the words of Carl Jung, that play and playfulness are essential parts of living a creative life. So, I'm going to give you some instructions if you could pay attention. So, here we have our first image. If you can look at this image, okay, look at this image carefully and think what first comes to mind. Just what first comes to mind, the very first thing that enters your mind. Please do not judge or analyze yourself, just what comes to mind. Then what I'd like you to do is turn to a neighbor, and if there are three of you, that's fine. Turn to a neighbor and share with each other just what came to mind and where you saw it in the image. And just take about 30 seconds, 45 seconds to do this. Just share that with anyone around. No matter what it is.
Something like that. Something a bit like
I see that as a well. That's why I think
First
And just what first came to mind, if you could just have several people maybe just shout it out. Just
Eggs in a nest.
eggs in the nest, okay?
An octopus speak.
Okay.
Scarecrow.
No, go ahead, no.
Scarecrow.
Scarecrow too.
Yeah, scarecrow.
Read a scarecrow.
Scarecrow.
Yeah.
I thought a tunnel.
Tunnel.
A jester's hat.
Yeah.
Father Christmas.
Sorry, Father Christmas, okay.
Joy.
Drawing.
Tea in a mug.
Anything else?
Nine.
Sorry?
An eye.
A vine? Did you say vine?
Eye.
The sun.
Star.
Venus flycatcher with teeth in the middle and a big eye.
Okay. Okay. I saw a vagina with teeth. Where am I? All right, now, what I'd like to do just on your own, again, just for about 30 seconds, on your own, internally, we don't not to verbalize this, but reflect on why you thought you saw what you did. Okay, all right. You can hold that thought to yourself. Yes, do you have a question? Okay.
When you finish.
All right, now, almost done. Now, in the original ink blot test that Rorschach developed, there were 5 black and white and 5 color images. So we're not going to have all 10. We're just going to do 2. So I thought we'd also show a color image. So same instructions, which I'll repeat. First, if you could look at this image and think about what first comes to mind, the very first thing that enters your mind. Please not try to judge or evaluate yourself or analyze it. Hold that. And when you've got that, turn to a neighbor, the same neighbor, different neighbor, whatever you'd like, and share what came to mind and where you saw it.
Yellow behind A walk in the country.
Oh, I was top of the rainforest. It's a good exercise.
Okay, can we hear some responses? What do people see and where? If there's a particular part of the image, where do they see it?
I was in a tree looking down on a sunlit lawn. Yes. I saw a bird on a leaf.
Yeah, me too. Like a little vulture.
Yeah.
Like a baby vulture.
I thought it was a parrot, yeah. I thought it was a parrot, the same thing.
So fruits or a plum?
Fruit or a plum?
Underwater.
Yes.
Swimming on the water.
I saw an aerial shot with the river and a man who's been fishing and holding his fish in his belly and his son looking down at the belly.
Others?
I saw cells under a microscope. Like in that sort of what they call like petri dishes.
Okay.
I've had a similar thing about like an egg being fertilised, sperm down in the bottom right corner. Sorry.
No apologies, no. It is about anything else? Anything like to share?
I thought of Ophelia in the water, surrounded by all her flowers, and this for me was what Ophelia was seeing before she closed her eyes.
Anyone else? Yes?
Eyes.
Sorry. I saw a fairy flying underwater. Okay, well, thank you very much. Now, just for a moment, reflect on what you saw, what you individually against before, so the ending the exercise, and why you might have tried to understand. We're thinking, drawing on Jung here, There's an unconscious part of this, there's a conscious part, and what might have led to that choice. Thank you very much.
You've looked at madge in defining, is she mad or what?
Yeah.
Is she an artist or not? Is she an outside artist? But no one has actually looked at her art. If you go into that gallery, the first thing that strikes me is she's not an artist in a conventional sense. She's a pattern maker. That's what she is. Not only is she a pattern maker, but she's an obsessive pattern maker. Her whole life is more material, more things. And into my head came my twin, the identical twin who's creative. When she can't cope with life, she knits. And so you go, and she's got 6-foot-long scarves, 8-foot-long scarves, umpteen blankets. When she's calm, she does the most wonderful poetry. And what strikes me beyond anything, but from a totally different angle, I'm an art historian and a psychologist, is the obsessional quality of her work.
Absolutely, yeah.
If you can't cope with life, you pretend it isn't happening, and you do crosswords, you play Scrabble, you play bridge, you make patterns. And that's what I feel I've missed so far from today. Not whether she was an artist, not whether she was an outside artist, not whether she was mad, but she had that element that we all had to some extent, that when things go wrong, we hide away, and I don't want any Freudian
No.
We hide away, and we do this obsessive activity. And her activity is obsessive. Who else wants to have miles of textile? And she's a pattern maker. She's not a creative artist in a conventional sense. Comment.
Well, a point well made. I did start my bit saying, well, this is when you stop looking at the pictures, the conversations that this has been about, what you stop looking at the pictures. I mean, that's why you're showing images, but a point well made. And although I know other people think about what she knows as a pattern maker, I think it is about the work. And the main thing is the work. It's just the background noise, and that background noise, and the work is the best and the most important thing. But anyone else wants to accept it as a point well made?
But for me, I noticed today that we haven't really gone into the spiritual aspect of her claim that she had a spirit guide. And I guess a question would be directed at the researcher, the biographer, sorry, I've forgotten your name, sir.
Roger.
Was the spirit guide gender? Was it a male or a female? Did this happen after the stillbirth of her daughter? Is there a link to that? And did the claims come directly from herself? Was this something that she put out there to the Seance group?
There are various sorts of evidence from Madge herself. One would be interviews that she gave often to spiritualist magazines, who were intent on finding in her a really good medium to talk about, as it were, propagandistic sort of venture. So she may well, in those circumstances, have played the part. And she does in one of her magazine interviews say that she didn't have a spirit guide. Well, she didn't sort of develop that aspect, but rather there was a force within herself. Now, in another series of possible documents you might look up were these rather weird writings that she did in the 1920s when she was in the hospital in Hove. It's on page 2 of our little crib, where she writes about the force that's coming from the doctor. So she's adopting the idea that the therapist is, in a sense, inspiring her to become crazy, or at least to be lyrical about her inner life. And so she's negotiating a different stand, as it were, on these issues. I think you can't really judge either way as to what's going on here. But from time to time, she writes the signature "men in arrest," and if challenged on that, she'll explain it as her spirit guide. That's fair enough. But in other contexts, she'll actually talk about a male voice talking to her. And I think one can accept that there are probably several spirit guides in the background waiting to prompt her and to be a reason why she's got something else to say. So she's in a bit of a turmoil, and that's part of her problem, I think. This is not really a case that can be easily resolved. We've spoken of her work as being inspired by spirit guide, as if that sort of settles the whole issue. But I think if you did have a spirit guide, if you imagine yourself having one, you would also be doubtful as to its gender. You might well be doubtful as to the advice you're getting, and whether it's actually the real thing or some kind of sham. And the whole history of spiritualism is counterbalanced by a history of its being a whole sham anyway. So that any medium is always, or was always in the 19th century, a propagandist for it being real. Not just everybody around me believes in this, so we don't have to go into this area. But the whole necessity to do a good performance, I think, begins to emerge. So these are her pictures when they work out, and she's pleased with them, are furthermore not only therapeutic for her, but they're also therapeutic for the cause of spiritualism in a way. And let's not forget, she did actually show some of these larger pictures to a very large audience in the Whitechapel Gallery.
I just want to comment on the lady who talked about his obsession. I guess it's, I wouldn't use the word obsessive personally, because I prefer to use the word prolific than obsessive, because obsessive is a diagnostic category, and to me it feels very circuitous to say she's obsessive or she's psychotic or she's alcoholic. Because it just takes us to the same point. I'm not sure, how that advances our understanding of her, or frankly any artist. And also to offer that in abstentia, I think is also problematic. I know it's done not infrequently, looking at the lives of artists or historical figures, but without having her in front of me across my consulting room, I'd be hesitant to describe her art with a mental health terminology.
Just picking up on the spirituals.
I just want to ask, what did she say herself about her art? Is at any point, have you got any records of what?
Can we just come back to that? Can we just hear more about the spiritualism and then come back to your point?
Well, we can talk. We keep wandering away from the artist herself and how she may have said she had a spiritual leader, but the point is, what did she say about her art herself? Did she ever talk about it, or what she produced? And the meaning of what she was producing herself?
Well, the answer is not very much.
Okay.
She doesn't say, she's not, as it were, being asked the right questions in the interviews. The interviews are more interested in the spiritualist phenomenon, the hallucinations or the visions.
It's dominating the discussion this afternoon, rather than looking at the art itself and saying, what does one see in it today, and what techniques did she use? What kind of fabric? There's a lot here that would be interesting to know about, and I'm just wondering, is there somebody
we can do the art history if we need to. But, and we can also argue about decoration, to go back to that earlier point, because I think she is a decorative artist, but that's not to say she's not an artist.
No, that was my gut feeling going into the gallery. The decorative artist or textile art designer. You could see. My friend here said, wallpapers. There's something, and there's a lot of Art Nouveau inspirations, and I thought of Aubrey Beardsley. There's a lot in her art that one might want to talk about, and I'm just curious if nobody wants to talk about her art.
They would make good wallpaper, but they would probably make better dresses or veils and scarves and things, or bedspreads. But she did actually make such things, so bedspreads and that kind of stuff. Cushions.
Well, I was going to say, do we know when she started how it came about that she did. Did somebody direct her towards it because it would be therapy for her in whatever it was she was suing for? Or did she herself gravitate towards it? Did she discover it for herself?
I think Roger
today she'd be making a living as a textile. But obviously at her time nobody really saw it as that.
It does seem to have been triggered at the age of about 40 by traumatic events, but Roger knows the story better than I do. That's how the story seems to read. She suddenly picked up a pen and started.
Needed that kind
and
of
it seemed to be maybe self-healing element that's making it up, but it's Roger, you know the...
Yeah, well, she starts out, this is where the postcards come in, which she uses through a lot of her career, through the 20s. But, you know, they're the most banal and easily accessible support that you can have to do pictures on. And I'm not sure if other people weren't doing the same thing. You know, amateur artists wanting to start, which we do. I'm doing some pictures on a bit of paper here, but, you know, whatever's to hand.
But it's like when somebody becomes creative at the age of 40, it is
it's an expression, it's not just a bit of therapy, I mean, it's something more than that. It's huge.
I don't think it is unusual. I go to city lit classes where people retire and discover they've got a great facility for the creative side of their personality.
Not when people retire, so it happens when people retire as well, it's only creativity.
I mean, it's full of people like that. And at the time it's full of people who pick up a paintbrush that's 65 or 70.
Oh, you're going to say, you had to...
We have another comment. I was going to take up the point that raised earlier about our not analysing the work so much. And I'm wondering whether what you said earlier about the importance of the biography of the outside art, that this is a consequence, that we need to somehow concentrate on the personal biography of the creator rather than looking at the work. Those two seem to...
And I think it is a problem myself.
Seems to go together. But in relation to being an artist, I think that Madge Gill did demonstrate that in terms of, you know, the work does get shown eventually, and that perhaps one of the things we could look at is things like abstraction rather than decoration or pattern. You know, there is a kind of engagement with that abstraction in the work, and that these are terms that are used in mainstream art criticism, and somehow there's a sort of difficulty to kind of join up with those because of the category that we're looking at outside art.
A lot of these faces look haunted, as though they're caught within a web.
And the same.
And the same. I mean, is it her face? What did she look like?
Or is it her mother's face? You know, is the dead absent mother behind the screen with them?
1920s flapper girl.
Sometimes Clara Bow, actually.
Sorry?
Clara Bow was an actress in the film industry in the 20s. And I think there's a certain amount of mileage in the theory that she's using news, popular press sort of images.
Yeah. She drew Mae West as well, didn't she? As well,
Mae West.
signed Mae West. Yeah.
We've even found one or two pictures which look like the interior of a 1920s cinema. So we're working on that theory.
Well, almost black and white, slightly Art Deco, isn't it?
Exactly.
Roger, there is that small postcard in the exhibition where she's drawn a face and one of the eyes is gouged out, which you could compare it with lots of her own eye. My feeling there are self-portraits over and over again.
Yes.
How was she discovered by the wider world?
How was she discovered?
Discovered by the wider world.
Only she had made herself available to the wide world in the 1930s and 40s, up until 1947. There was a period when she regularly exhibited in the East End Academy, so-called, which is an amateur art venue at the Whitechapel Gallery. And she got into the press a few times, and sometimes was in the Times and so on. But that then withered away for some reason, or maybe she just got bored, or maybe she doesn't want any more fuss about herself. I think she was very, very much against being fussed over.
What year was it when she was 40?
1920, thereabouts, 21.
Right. I was just thinking who was painting and drawing at the time that she was
That's right. But then when the real discovery came when her son, when she died, her son waited a year or so, got fed up with all the junk in the house, I think, and didn't know what to do, so went round to the local library and fortunately met the librarian, a very thoughtful man called James Green, who took over the whole stuff that he had in the house. Some of it also went out into another direction, into the mercantile world, where reports about things can be verified, but it's not always clear where things have come from. And there is, as it were, traffic in leftover pictures and things that might have gone through various hands before they become visible to the wider public. So we can't know everything, but we do know that Jean Dubuffet, the art brut specialist, came to London in late 60s, and bought up a lot of stuff. So if you go to the Art Brut Museum in Lausanne, you will see more of the pictures that we've shown you here.
And we're showing the pictures to keep the work in the room, as opposed to just the question and answer. I think hopefully as they go around again, you see more each time. That it's very much intended to keep her and the work here.
I just wanted to make a point about religion and spiritual beliefs, which are actually, there's lots of evidence that they're very protective of one's mental health and promote one's well-being, but I think in a white Western secular context we often shy away from discussion of spirituality and religion, but perhaps it was a great comfort to her.
But what spirituality in her case? What form did the spirituality?
Well, we've heard a bit about that, that she maybe had a guide, or she heard...
That's one sentence. She had a guide. What did the guide say to her?
Well, we don't know much about her experience at that because well, I'm just suggesting it may have been.
She certainly seems to be part of this spiritual revival after the First World War.
It
was very much around.
There was a lot of it about then.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a second wave in a way. So it's very much the culture of the time to be part of that.
We have the spiritualist expert,
Vivian. I was going to turn to Vivian. So Vivian did a lot of the research on the spiritual aspect of the show. Do you want to contribute anything?
I think that one thing that hasn't been mentioned, there were reams and reams of papers with religious content in them that she wrote, and that's sort of been looked at by Roger at the moment. So there was definitely a religious part of her.
She wrote.
Yes, that she wrote.
Did she tend to do automatic writing?
Yes.
Oh yes.
Yes. Yeah, very much.
Well, she may or may not have thought of it quite in those terms, but certainly she was left-handed, so to speak, in that sense of not really controlling what she's writing, and it's quite clear from the poor punctuation and the stabbing of the page at times even that she's half disgusted with it. It's something that she's got to get rid of in a way. And some of her writings are actually peculiarly expressionistic, you might say. They have flagrant imagery of volcanoes bursting out and so on, and flames in the sky. And I think these are partly transcriptions of real experiences, hallucinatory visions and so on, but partly there's a sort of impulse to just get rid of nasty thoughts, which is where a lot of automatic writing takes you, in fact.
Any more question?
Yes, I was going to ask, but as I'm looking at the work that she's done, I think there's an awful lot of intertextuality here and references to work that maybe Margaret MacDonald did, who was married to Rennie Mackintosh. And then I'm just thinking what you're saying about this whole spiritual aspect, whether she was influenced by that. But I think there's a lot of intertextuality in that there are lots of references to popular culture and other things that were going on.
She lived in a world,
She lives in that world, rather than her having this spiritual influence. I think that it's all very referential to what's gone before. There's a huge amount of intertextuality there from what I can see from what Margaret MacDonald produced around about that period in the 1990s.
The problem though is that we don't know exactly what Madge saw or didn't see, so we can, from an art historical point of view, of course you can make those links, like we in our perspective can make those links, but they're not necessarily the links that Madge really did have. And I think that's where it's always a construct, isn't it? We're bringing like our 21st century perspective to this, and that's why we particularly in this seminar wanted to focus on the other perspectives. We could have done probably done a whole day on
art history and madge gill, but we've chosen specifically in the publication in this work to focus on the other perspectives.
You do have the lady in the black top.
Yeah, Kathy's actually our artist in residence. I want to mention her and welcome you all to meet Kathy and maybe see some of her work that she's making.
Fantastic.
I know that, especially Roger also said about the wars and everything, but thinking about the East End, I mean, and her images are really fractured with so much architectural things and people within them. But the devastation of the wars within, the East End, and I cannot imagine what that would have been like to be surviving in that time. And that must have really impacted on her, just her visions, her own visual vocabulary, what was coming out of her, because she was living in that completely fractured life. And regardless, there would have been so many people dying, and of course that's why, this whole thing with the spirituality and, to reach those people that you've lost. But I just cannot imagine what that would have been like to have lived at that time within, and seeing 2 First World Wars and the epidemics of the flu, like the gentleman did mention, the historian. So I think that alone is an amazing thing to, as a visual thing to be expressing.
Well, there's obviously a gap in my research. I'll have to go down wherever you go to find out where the bombs fell in Upton Park. Because if they fell anywhere near her house, that would have been truly apocalyptic, and it would have triggered off any kind of strange fantasy, wouldn't it?
I think the great thing about that is it makes it so. I think it makes it ordinary, because one of the things you always do when you talk about outside your art, or any not mental health patient, because we're not talking about that, but it's that sense of otherness. Where other in this person? And when you put her in the context of the Great War, for example, when you think of how many people lost someone in the Great War, we saw the armistice only a couple of days ago. We're going to have another big event next year, which is going to come home to us. The impact that had on everybody, and madge is part of that. She becomes part of that much bigger story, and that's the framework for me that we have to put her in, because it's easy to look at all the things that are different about her and say, this is how she's different. And I think one of the things that we have to say is, this is how she's the same, because she's part of a much wider story that involves a lot more people.
And I think that's sort of just the reference we made earlier to popular culture is really interesting. This is something Kathy's been looking at. In fact, we want to invite you all to an event in the new year, which is going to be exploring that, really positive influence on madge gill's life. So, she'll enjoy going to the cinema, the music, the popular culture she might have consumed, and how did that have an impact, the fashions, the hats, that's very probably I think of hats earlier. So, there is that other aspect where she's not other, she's part of a society, she's part of, that period in history.
But what was a very interesting thing about, I know that this is a later film to even talk about, and she'd already established, this vocabulary. But when you look at the press, the Michael Powell film, the
Lost Kingdom?
No.
Peeping Tom?
It was first called Stairway to Heaven,
Oh,
1946, and then it got changed into something more than death.
Life and Death of
Matter of Life and Death.
Matter of Life and
Matter of
Death.
Life.
Now the vision, just the fact that even when that came out, that was such a very, very huge film that people, and you look at that film, there's huge amounts of people, all the same types of faces, there's the stairways, there's these very, very interesting images, but of course she had established doing these types of images in her work, but it's a very interesting film, had that been something that she might have seen, had that influenced her too in any way.
Would she have read the works of Freud at all? Would she be familiar with Freudian thought?
This is very unlikely. But it's possible, though. He was probably his translation won't be published. He came to London in 1939. He was very much fleeing the Nazis. He was at the end of his life. The material would have been around. It was influencing culture by then as well, wasn't it? Surrealism had been gone, and was had its first 20 years. So yeah, it would have been in the ether, wouldn't it? And 1940s films have used Freud in them. 40s, they referenced Freud in the 1930s and 40s films, and I think, yeah, so it would have been part of the culture.
Spellbound.
Yeah. But I don't know if there was a library in the house, I don't know if any books were found in the house. We know anything about what she might have read. You said her writing isn't that literate.
Yeah, she's obviously has access to something, like books on astrology and so on.
Yeah.
Probably cheap magazines and books which kind of circulate around, and a much thumbed copy of the Bible and so on. All these. This is the minimum library that she has. I don't know whether. Sorry, I was going to say I don't know whether you would find Picture Post or that kind of magazine, which would have lots of pictures of people staring at you, concentration camp victims and so on. So there are these powerful, culturally coded images that might lie somewhere behind what she's doing.
Sometimes you think she's seen Viennese artists like Klimt, or Munch even.
Yeah, she might well have done.
Would you have known these artists?
There's no reason to say that she couldn't have done.
No.
But whether she would normally have done that, I would doubt. Where would she go? She'd have to go to the National Gallery, Tate Modern or something.
Well, I suppose books.
Yeah. I don't think a lot of Nolde and company was circulating in Britain in the immediate post-war era. In fact, we've only quite recently understood that there was another art going on that the Nazis were very good at, really, suppressing. We didn't get little of it came through to Britain, even in the 50s.
She says she sold none of her work during her life. She didn't think she had the right to sell her work. Am I remembering that right?
She didn't know. She did exhibit from time to time, notably in the Russian Aid for Russia exhibition, which was a selling exhibition in aid for our then ally and the sufferings of Russian people at the hands of the Wehrmacht and so on. So she put out one of her calico pictures into this sort of selling exhibition, which was held in the Wallace collection. And I've noticed artists that I'm interested in, like Paul Nash and Graham Sutherland, put in, quite a nice landscape from Sutherland, 60 quid, rather nice, already framed. So that was given to charity, in effect. And with a cast of about 200 or 300 artists, which are all named in the catalogue, you find Mrs. M.E. Gill, calico untitled, £1,000. So you can guess what was in her mind, I think, that this is too precious, really, to let go. I could imagine her fighting like tooth and nail. How's that expression go?
Tooth and nail.
Tooth and nail, to stop it being sold if somebody put up the money, because she didn't want to sell it.
Would she have been invited to submit to that?
There was probably her sons that saw an ad in the paper, something like this, or phoned up the News Chronicle to find out what the reference was that they'd read about in the paper.
Roger, wasn't it more the fact that she felt it wasn't hers to sell, as she'd been guided to produce this thing?
That's one thing.
I thought she was just a conduit for the art.
Said, yeah.
It wasn't hers to sell, that's why she wouldn't sell it.
Well, that could also be construed as an excuse.
She produced it because she had to produce it, not because she needed to sell or wanted to sell it. She couldn't stop herself.
She couldn't stop making it, but she couldn't actually get rid of it. And I think when her son got rid of it, I think he was probably went around the local library and tried to work it out with a heavy heart. And James Green sort of helped him to see it was going to be looked after, and spoke then of local history as the kind of motto. We must protect local heritage and the heritage of our area of London. And maybe there was a kind of local patriotism sort of quality there. She's still not really very well known in East London, I must say.
There is a madge gill
times are
way,
changing.
I found.
There is a madge gill way.
Way, a road. There's a road
You
linked
should
up
go
there.
and track it down. I think it's
It
really a
doesn't
car
look
park.
too- yeah. Newham Way doesn't look that exciting.
Can't see that.
I must say, I'm
Google
going to do
Maps it.
something
Google
cynical
Maps it.
line here. I am a psychologist. I am an art historian of dozens of books. But here, Madge's context was her own little home that she couldn't cope with, and that she feverishly had to somehow compulsively, obsessively, couldn't stop doing this. Her work does not represent her knowledge of Klimt. No one had a knowledge of Klimt at the time. Her work presents her and her obsessive pattern making that made life feel safe. And I just want to say one word to the whole audience, which is a word of warning: over-interpretation.
But is that kind of art that tends to be called outside? There's someone in their own little universe doing the work to survive, they're not to show other people. So that tends to fall in this box, and we've got three of the great men of British outside art here. Here we've got Roger and John Minfield. I know you add a bit of an outside art angle to this, because between Roger, John and Henry, the two men who have mainly brought outside art into the UK, I would say. I think it's fair to say it's really pretty crucial. Anything to
help orient people towards seeing something that was otherwise not there.
Help orientate. Anything you want to on the outside of art?
I'm not very good at talking in public. John, anything to say?
I would just say that I don't think there's any chance that she's influenced by anything at all throughout her life. I think she's a very, very powerful, creative force there, and I think she'd be impervious to influence myself. One very, very sad observation is that Tate Britain hasn't even got one postcard. It's quite shameful, really, that we've got no permanent collection of her work on display. I mean, most towns in Europe would have a Madge Gill museum, like 20 years ago. I don't know what we can do about that. It's just quite shocking. We've not really got one here. She is the greatest British outsider artist, easily. Output was incredible. There's scale work, all the different sorts of work she did. And this is very sad, really. And it's a reflection of the way that, sort of over the years, the British art establishment has seen outside art.
Is that about this country? I mean, how do outsider artists fare in other countries?
Oh, yeah, completely different.
Right, so they are celebrated in different
Oh,
ways.
yeah. Massive museums and everything.
Whereas they're marginalised here.
I don't think they're marginalised, just totally ignored.
Okay. It's a form of marginalisation.
Can you remind me, I'm sorry, but I once went to a big outsider art weekend at Tate Modern, quite a long time ago, and there was a woman who was the curator of an outsider art museum. Was it Baltimore in the States?
Yes.
Rebecca Hofberger. Rebecca Hofberger.
The Visionary Art Museum.
Was it Baltimore?
There's certainly there's a big museum in Baltimore.
Yeah, it was, and she taught us, and going back to what Ruth was saying, I do remember she showed a lot of this outsider art who absolutely fills the profile that we just gone through. This little guy who lived in a basement room, never talked to anybody. He was considered an outsider in society, a bit of a sort of a recluse and a tramp almost. And when he died, they opened up these basement apartment where he lived, and it was just absolutely
Henry Darger, maybe. Probably Henry Darger. Probably Henry Darger.
I can't remember his name. I can't remember his name, but it was extraordinary stuff that he done. All this obsessively, like Ruth.
And that was about to be thrown out as well, wasn't it? It was about to heading towards the bins.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
Yeah. It's extraordinary, but it's not rare, or not as rare as we might think. People have made things, hidden them away. Nobody knew until they died what was under the bed. Uncle George was up in the attic, mysteriously keeping away from his family, at it all the time. There's another artist called Monsieur who makes little postcard-sized pictures with lots of faces. So we've got kind of almost groups and artistic groups emerging, but they don't know each other, of course. But there are mysteries about why certain things take the shape that they do. But it's all very it's fraught with enigma. This whole area. We can usually expect Grace and Perry and other people to come forth and explain themselves on television at great length because they're ready for it. They know what artists are supposed to do, especially in the new media age that we're in. Whereas Madge Gill would have, although she gave these couple of interviews, they weren't to art magazines, certainly.
You know, the lovely phrase what you use that each artist is a movement of one. They have their own solo. So each so individual, they can't really clump them together, but each is a movement of one. They don't follow a trend, they don't follow Cubism or...
That's right.
Could you tell us whether the gallery, does the gallery close at 4 today? Because I feel I want to go and have a look at the work.
When does it
We
go?
close at 4:30, but we can keep it open a little bit longer if anyone wants to.
Whether we take
And I think it would
as well.
be the right thing to do to go back and look at the work, see what the work. I mean, do people want, it's quarter to all, do people, has anyone else wanted to bring any, would people prefer to go back to the gallery, or are there more issues?
Did you mention that there's that programme Tuesday night?
I did mention it earlier, but I mentioned it again. So imagine the TV show Imagine, the outside hours, 10:45?
10:35 BBC One.
Yes, you join me there.
Before you all get up, Betsy just wants to say closing remarks.
Is everyone happy with that and get back to the art?
Yeah, great. So before we go over to the gallery, I'd just like to ask you to join me again in thanking our speakers, David, Roger, Paul and Rob. Thank you. Coming. We do have the catalogue over there, so please have a look. There's lots more detail. There's lots of images in there as well. It's a very beautiful book. And also, we'd really like to hear your views just about how this event went and anything else you'd like to tell us. We've got some evaluation forms over there, so please take a minute just to tell us something about it, or come and talk to me or another member of staff. And the other thing to mention was just about Kathy and having a studio. Now, Kathy's been chosen as an artist whose work brings another perspective to Madge Gill. She's interested in Madge, and she said today that if anyone's interested to have a little look at work she's getting on with, we would have an open studio moment. Is that right?
Just in the corner by the cafe.
And we also are planning an event which actually follows on from quite a lot of the comments you've been talking about, which is what other influences were going on in Madge's life. So from popular culture, like Rachel was saying, to music, to things that were part of the society and the culture of the time. And that's on the 18th of January, and this sheet tells you a bit more about it. It's a free event run by Kathy. They're just over there on the table at the back. So thank you once
Hello. Was it going? I suddenly got worried.
Hello.